October 14th, 1944. The ruins of Aachen trembled with the sound of close-quarters battle. It was the first German city to face American assault inside the Reich, and every street, cellar, and pillbox had become a miniature fortress. Rain dripped through shattered rafters as the men of Company E, 26th Infantry Regiment, pressed through the west edge of the city toward a concrete knot of the Siegfried Line. Behind them, the familiar bark of Browning rifles faded into the low hiss of a weapon few had yet used in earnest, the M2 flamethrower. Sergeant Thomas Keegan, 24, carried one of the 40-pound cylinders on his back, its twin tanks sloshing with thickened gasoline. The hose and wand protruding from the assembly looked clumsy, almost theatrical, but every man in the platoon gave him space as if he carried judgment itself. The squad halted before a steel-shuttered embrasure sunk into the hillside. A German MG-42 had pinned them for half an hour. Keegan dropped to one knee beside the corner of the pillbox, the nozzle trembling slightly in the drizzle. His assistant twisted open the nitrogen propellant valve and shouted over the din, "Pressure up." When Keegan pulled the trigger, the world erupted. A ribbon of orange-white fire leapt forward with a roar like tearing canvas. The thickened fuel gasoline, mixed with aluminum napalm powder, adhered to the wet concrete, flowed around the embrasure lip, and crawled up the wall as if alive. Inside the pillbox, German machine gunners screamed. The weapons stream, moving at 100 feet per second, followed the interior draft of air drawn through the firing slit. Observers later wrote that the flame turned corners. To those trapped inside, it truly seemed to climb uphill. Minutes later, black smoke boiled from the firing port. The MG-42 fell silent. 8 grey-clad figures stumbled out, hands raised, faces blistered, shouting, "Kamerad, the presser." Americans herded them away without a shot. Keegan slumped beside his weapon, breathing hard through his mask. His sergeant muttered, "One burst, and they all came out. I'd trade a dozen grenades for that hose." The Battle of Aachen revealed what physics textbooks could explain, but soldiers could not yet believe. Fire, when pushed by compressed gas, behaves like a fluid. The M2's pressurized nitrogen expelled its mixture at nearly 100 pounds per square inch, atomizing it into a semi-liquid stream that clung to surfaces and followed air currents. Where ordinary gasoline burned off instantly, napalm's gel sustained combustion for up to a minute. In enclosed spaces, it consumed oxygen faster than men could breathe, creating partial vacuums that slammed doors shut and extinguished lungs before flames touched skin. To German defenders accustomed to grenades and small arms duels, this was sorcery. Corporal Erwin Schroeder of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, captured near the Lausberg district, told his interrogators, "The flame ran along the ground and then rose up the wall. We thought they had phosphorus spirits, black magic fire that hunts you." Similar phrases recur throughout captured diaries: Teufelsfeuer, devil's fire, schwarze Magie, black magic. One wounded officer wrote that the Americans had fire that bends like wire. Inside the city, the psychological effect was immediate. U.S. Army observers from the 75th Engineer Battalion noted that surrender rates tripled whenever flamethrowers were deployed. In one 24-hour period, 47 Germans surrendered from a single block after witnessing 2 flame assaults. Even rumors of the weapon's presence emptied cellars before contact. The Geneva Convention had not banned flamethrowers, but both sides treated them with a moral weight beyond ordinary arms. German officers routinely executed captured Soviet flame troops on the Eastern Front. By Aachen, that precedent reversed. German soldiers preferred captivity to the possibility of burning. From a logistical standpoint, the weapon's success rested on American industry. Each M2 unit required approximately 5 gallons of thickened gasoline and 1 cylinder of compressed nitrogen per firing. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps delivered thousands of pre-filled fuel tanks labeled Flame, Portable, Type M2 through depots in Liège and Maastricht. Field engineers at forward supply points refilled spent cylinders using mobile compressors mounted on half-tracks. Igniters, small magnesium cartridges fired electrically, were issued by the hundred. The American ability to feed even such specialized weapons was an extension of the same abundance that filled their artillery parks and fuel dumps. In contrast, German flamethrowers, the Flammenwerfer 41 and its simplified variant, the 42, relied on volatile hydrogen-nitrogen mixtures that corroded seals and limited range to under 30 yards. Their fuel lines were prone to rupture, turning operators into walking torches. By late 1944, production shortages meant that few frontline units retained functioning sets. The Wehrmacht's Propagandaabteilung reported that enemy flame weapons operate without pause, ours are seen seldom, for lack of materials. The terrain of Aachen made the flamethrowers' capabilities even more pronounced. The city's pre-war basements and interlocking bunkers created a labyrinth of covered positions, ideal for defense but deadly under fire. High explosive shells shattered walls but left internal chambers intact. Flame, by contrast, reached into air vents, sewers, and cracks. One combat engineer described it as pouring sunlight into holes. When the jets of burning gel struck masonry, they created pressure waves that traveled through corridors faster than sound. Men in adjoining rooms felt the blast as an invisible punch that stripped paint and skin alike. After the battle, a medical team from the U.S. Army's 9th Medical Laboratory conducted examinations of surrendered German soldiers. Many showed no external burns, but severe pulmonary damaged lungs, seared by superheated gases and carbon monoxide. The report concluded that psychological trauma exceeds physical injury. Most casualties succumb to terror before thermal effects. German medical officers later confirmed this finding in their own post-action notes, labeling flame victims as shock cases. By the end of October, Aachen had fallen. 1,700 German defenders were killed, over 5,000 captured. In post-combat analysis, the 1st Infantry Division recorded that the integration of flamethrower teams with engineers reduced bunker clearing time by more than half. Where demolitions once required 20 minutes and multiple satchel charges, a single 10-second flame burst sufficed. The men who wielded the weapon seldom celebrated. In letters home, they wrote with unease. Private William D. of the 2nd Battalion confessed, "It's a cruel thing. They come out screaming, but you don't hate them after. You just keep moving." Yet the same weapon saved his squad from weeks of attrition. Colonel Clarence Parkins summarized it in his after-action briefing. "Our infantry could not have taken Aachen without flame." For German survivors, the memory lingered as myth. Decades later, in a 1962 Veterans Symposium in Bonn, former Feldwebel Heinz Ritter recalled the sensation vividly. "It was not like any weapon we knew. Fire is supposed to go upward. Theirs came sideways, through the cracks, under the door. It was like fighting the devil himself." In the technical notes of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, the phenomenon had a simple explanation: combustion under pressure, atomization, oxygen entrainment. But on those autumn streets, in the half-light of shattered houses, the men who faced it saw only impossible fire, liquid that burned, smoke that screamed, and an enemy who seemed to command the elements. Thus began the legend whispered through the German lines that autumn, the belief that the Americans possessed a black magic flame, a weapon born not of chemistry, but of sorcery. In truth, it was born of factories, of steady logistics, of an army that could ship fire by the gallon. Yet to those who watched it crawl along a wall and devour the dark, the distinction hardly mattered. October 21st, 1944. The smoke of Aachen still clung to the air like breath on glass. Along the West Wall, German officers of the 49th Infantry Division were collecting reports from the remnants of their platoons. Many of these accounts, later captured by Allied intelligence, spoke less of bullets and shells than of something unseen that broke men's courage before their bodies. "It was the fire weapon again," one corporal wrote. "It comes from nowhere, crawls along the ground, and then we can no longer think. It is not war, it is witchcraft." The German word that appeared most often in these diaries and field notes was Teufelsfeuer, the devil's stuff. Sometimes it appeared beside hexenwerk, witchcraft. Men who had survived the freezing chaos of the Eastern Front, who had fought tanks and endured artillery, now deserted positions rather than face the portable flamethrower. The reason was not merely the physical destruction it caused, but the way it rewired human instincts. Fire is older than language. It demands respect, fear, distance. When it arrives in a sealed bunker with nowhere to run, it strips soldiers down to the simplest reflex: escape. The U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division began noticing the pattern during the autumn campaigns of 1944. Prisoners taken near Aachen, Schmidt, and the Huertgen forest described the same symptoms: racing pulse, trembling hands, and overwhelming dread even when no flame weapon was present. Analysts called it anticipatory shock. The presence of flame operators in a unit, or even rumors of them, multiplied surrender rates. In one engagement near Verlautenheide, a company of the 9th Panzer Division surrendered without direct contact after seeing fuel tanks being unloaded from an American truck. Medical sections of the Wehrmacht recorded parallel observations. Dr. Karl Menzel, chief surgeon of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, wrote in his field log on November 3, 1944, "Men suffer hallucinations of fire after bombardment. They see flames in the dark, smell burning when there is none. The weapon is feared more than any bomb." He recommended temporary withdrawal of troops exposed to flame attacks for psychological recovery, but by then no reserves were available. The terror was intensified by the way the weapon defied ordinary military logic. Machine guns fired in lines, mortars arced through the air. Fire, however, flowed like liquid thought, bending with the wind, rolling across puddles, clinging to walls. German instructors at the Aachen Defense School had warned new recruits to expect flamethrowers to hug the ground, but napalm's gel made that rule obsolete. Soldiers watched in disbelief as burning fuel slid up embankments or wrapped around barricades. In debriefings, they said it looked alive, as if the Americans had taught fire to obey orders. German propaganda tried to counter this fear with technical explanations. The Völkischer Beobachter published an article on November 15th, claiming that American flamethrowers used petroleum mixed with phosphorus, implying chemical violation rather than sorcery. But frontline soldiers had already drawn their own conclusions. They believed the Americans had found a way to make waterburn reports described liquid fire that cannot be extinguished. In reality, this was napalm, thickener, a powdered aluminum soap developed at Harvard by Dr. Louis Fieser. When mixed with gasoline, it created a sticky gel that burned even on wet surfaces. To a man crouched in a rain-soaked trench, it felt supernatural. The U.S. Army made careful note of this reaction. Field circulars instructed officers to use flamethrowers not merely as engineering tools but as psychological weapons. A single burst could empty a structure faster than hours of bombardment. In combat films later studied by the Army's Historical Division, surrender usually occurred within 5 seconds of ignition. The weapon's visual and auditory shock, a deep hissing roar, followed by a rolling boom, overpowered rational defense. The sound alone, one captured German officer admitted, tells you that the gods have changed sides. There was, too, the moral dimension. Even hardened soldiers hesitated to use flame at first. American troops described a visceral recoil when seeing an enemy consumed, but the practical efficiency outweighed hesitation. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph M. Eaton of the 1st Infantry Division wrote, "A man who will not surrender to shell fire will surrender to flame. It is the difference between danger and damnation." The statement, chilling in its clarity, summarized the shift in modern warfare, the replacement of courage with calculation. Flamethrower operators became both feared and isolated within their own ranks. They were prime targets. German snipers sought them first, recognizing the twin cylinders as death's own emblem. Many carried pistols only, unable to shoulder a rifle with the heavy gear, yet they also held a strange prestige. Among infantrymen, the flame gunner was half engineer, half-executioner, a man who walked carrying both light and annihilation. After Aachen, platoons often volunteered to guard flamethrower teams so they would not walk alone. German prisoners, questioned by the US 7th Army in December, confessed to new superstitions. Some believed that American flamethrower fuel contained devil's oil, shipped from Africa, imbued with the heat of the equator. Others swore that the Americans had discovered a chemical that made fire seek metal, explaining why jets seemed to curve toward gun barrels. The British historian Basil Liddell Hart, reviewing these reports after the war, remarked that modern warfare had revived medieval imagination. The Germans' own technical branch attempted countermeasures longer-range Flammenwerfer 42, models, trench sprinklers, asbestos-lined suits, but production collapsed under Allied bombing. Meanwhile, the Americans refined the M2's ignition system, adding twin magnesium cartridges to ensure firing even in damp conditions. Where German units rationed flame fuel by the litre, US engineers spoke in gallons, refilling cylinders by the score. It was not only firepower that terrified the enemy, it was abundance itself. By the time the Huertgen, forest battles dragged into winter, Teufelsfeuer had become a common term across the Western Front. The German High Command issued a circular instructing troops to remain in position under flame attack. Panic is more fatal than fire. But as one surviving sergeant later wrote, "You can command men against bullets, not against burning air." When Aachen finally fell on October 21st, American soldiers found graffiti on the inner wall of a captured bunker. "Wir kämpfen gegen schwarze Magie." We are fighting black magic. It was not propaganda, it was confession. For the defenders of the Reich, the war of steel and powder had given way to something older and more primal, a war of fear, fought not in the open fields of tactics, but in the narrow, airless spaces where a man's courage melted before the heat arrived. By the end of that autumn, the term black magic had spread from rumour to report, appearing even in official Wehrmacht communiques. The weapon that had begun as an engineer's tool had become a legend. And in the minds of those who faced it, science had crossed into sorcery. The story of the American flamethrower was not born in Aachen's ruins, but in the workshops and proving grounds of an industrial nation that believed no problem, moral or mechanical, was unsolvable with enough engineering. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it possessed only a few experimental flame weapons, crude designs copied from early British and German models. Within 3 years, the US Army had produced over 24,000 portable flamethrowers and nearly 200 armoured flame tanks, refining the technology from a volatile curiosity into a disciplined instrument of war. The first American pattern, the M1, appeared in 1942. It was a temperamental machine, heavy, fragile, and prone to misfire. Its ignition relied on a small torch fueled by bottled hydrogen, a system that often failed, in rain or wind. The fuel was ordinary gasoline, unthickened and quick-burning, giving the weapon a range of barely 20 yards. Yet, in the Pacific, where the enemy defended caves and pillboxes with fanatical tenacity, even this crude tool proved transformative. The U.S. Marine Corps' early reports from Guadalcanal and Tarawa reached Washington, describing how the weapon smoked the enemy out of holes impervious to shell or bullet. Engineers at the Chemical Warfare Service's Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, studied those reports with clinical fascination. Their solution was the M1A1, a lighter version with an improved ignition coil and better harness, but it was still not enough. The weapon's biggest flaw remained its fuel, liquid gasoline that splashed, evaporated, and burned too fast to penetrate fortifications. What the military needed was a flame that could cling, crawl, and endure. In July 1942, chemists at Harvard University's Secret War Research Division developed an answer that changed warfare's chemistry. Under Professor Louis Fieser, a team working on incendiary compounds for bombs discovered that adding aluminum naphthenate and palmitate to gasoline turned it into a sticky gel that burned longer and hotter. They named it napalm, from the combination of naphthenic and palmitic acids. When mixed in field tanks, the substance transformed gasoline's ephemeral flash into a weapon that could grip concrete like tar and roll down tunnel walls like molten wax. By late 1943, the improved M2 flamethrower incorporated these chemical advances. Two cylindrical tanks carried roughly 5 gallons of napalm thickened fuel, while a smaller nitrogen cylinder pressurized the mixture to 90 pounds per square inch. At the weapon's tip, an electrical ignition system fired twin magnesium cartridges, capable of generating a flame at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. With napalm, its effective range doubled to 40 yards. The flame did not simply project, it flowed. To the soldier carrying it, the M2 was both tool and burden. Fully charged, it weighed about 70 pounds. The operator, bent under the twin tanks, resembled a deep-sea diver trudging through mud. In combat, he was an irresistible target. German snipers were trained to aim for the base of the tanks, though in truth the nitrogen charge rarely caused explosions. American manuals instructed flame teams to move only under covering fire and to strike from flanks or behind armor. Despite the risks, demand for trained operators grew. Every infantry regiment was allotted at least 2 per battalion, and specialized engineer units were created solely to handle flame operations. Training took place at Camp Seibert, Alabama, where instructors drilled soldiers not only in handling but in psychology. "You must treat the flame like a living thing," one manual warned. "Feed it, direct it, and it will work for you. Hesitate, and it will turn on you." Trainees learned to clear weapon blockages with wire probes, to check valves for leaks, and to judge range by the color of the flame, bright yellow for too rich, white for proper mix. To steady their aim, instructors made them fire in rhythmic bursts, 1, 2, then cease, each lasting about half a second. Continuous fire risked overpressure or emptying the tanks too soon. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the M2 had become standard issue for U.S. engineer and assault units. Each division landing on the beaches carried at least 75 portable sets. The first reports from hedgerow country astonished commanders. A single burst could flush an entire German position that had resisted mortar fire for hours. Napalm clung to shutters, seeped into loopholes, and pooled inside bunkers. Its odor, an acrid sweetness of burning aluminum and rubber, became unmistakable. German soldiers, who had encountered the short-range Flammenwerfer 41 earlier in the war, expected brief bursts of flame that could be dodged. What they saw instead was a continuous stream that lingered like molten metal, coiling around obstacles and following air currents into trenches. To the eye, it defied nature's rules, fire moving sideways, burning on water, flowing uphill. The Chemical Warfare Service's technical bulletin explained the effect as adhesion of the gel to rough surfaces combined with convection drafts, but such explanations did not reach the front. In captured diaries from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, soldiers described it as fire that creeps like a snake. From the American side, the weapon's reliability came from industry. The 5-gallon fuel mix for each unit was filled in standardized containers labeled flame fuel, F2. The quartermaster depots at Cherbourg and Antwerp processed more than 10,000 gallons daily, blending gasoline and napalm powder in rotating drums driven by truck engines. Field refilling required no special tools, just a funnel, a wrench, and a steady hand. Engineers could recharge a unit in under 5 minutes. The magnesium ignition cartridges were shipped in tins of 20, each worth a soldier's life in damp weather. Compared with German counterparts, who often carried outdated chemical flamethrowers fueled by thickened oil and nitrogen peroxide, the M2 represented an industrial miracle of simplicity. It had no moving mechanical parts besides a trigger valve, no electric pumps, and no volatile gases. It relied purely on pressure, gravity, and chemistry, the most reliable allies in modern war. In the chaos of the European winter, where the Wehrmacht rationed gasoline by the litre, Americans seemed to possess infinite reserves. German intelligence officers noted bitterly that the enemy burns fuel as we drink water. Indeed, by December 1944, the US Army's European supply chain delivered over 1 million gallons of flamethrower fuel to forward depots, much of it unused because targets ran out before resources did. To the engineers who built it, the M2 was an elegant machine. To those who faced it, it was alchemy, a conjured element that made Earth itself burn. In the smoke-filled alleys of Aachen, soldiers swore they saw the flames leap toward them, as if guided by unseen hands. Yet behind that spectacle stood nothing mystical at all, only pressure, fuel, and the cold logic of American industry. By the war's end, the United States had turned the flamethrower from an improvised terror into a standardized weapon of doctrine. It was the mechanical expression of the nation's larger truth, that mastery of fire, like mastery of production, was a matter of mathematics and machinery. And in that balance between chemistry and fear, between design and destruction, the M2 became not just a weapon of war, but a symbol of what terrified Germany most: the precision of American abundance. By the winter of 1944, the American flamethrower had evolved from a strange engineering novelty into an integral arm of urban and bunker warfare. Yet behind the physics and statistics stood the men who carried it, the firemen, as both allies and enemies called them. They were not engineers in white coats, but infantrymen chosen for steadiness under pressure, men who could walk toward a doorway knowing that every rifle in 100 yards would aim for the 2 fuel tanks on their backs. In the 99th Infantry Division's assault on the Siegfried Line near Monschau, Lieutenant Charles Brenner remembered choosing flame operators carefully. "You needed someone with a mechanic's hands and a priest's calm," he later wrote. "If you shook, the flame shook with you." His teams moved in pairs, one carrying the weapon, the other guarding him with a carbine and watching the nitrogen gauge. The partnership bred a rare intimacy. Many flame men spoke of their assistants as shadow brothers, knowing that survival required perfect timing. In action, the rhythm was ritualistic. The rifleman laid down, covering fire. The engineer crept forward until the target filled his sight. A hand signal, 2 fingers raised, and then the hiss, the roar, the moment when light erased everything else. Veterans said that the heat could be felt through thick clothing 20 feet behind the operator. Concrete walls steamed, the air filled with an oily fog that stuck to the skin. Even those who had fired artillery described it as different. Artillery was distant, flame was intimate. After each assault, the aftermath fell silent. Germans who survived often emerged in shock, unarmed, muttering prayers or incoherent pleas. The American troops were instructed to accept all surrenders immediately, partly from humanity, partly because resistance could rekindle panic. Those who witnessed it never forgot. One medic recorded, "The smell after a flame attack is not of death but of chemistry. Burnt oil, rubber, earth, it's the odor of war's machinery, not men." Inside the units, flamethrower specialists developed their own culture. They joked grimly about carrying hell's backpack. They modified their equipment, wrapping the hose in burlap to reduce glare, or taping the wand trigger for smoother bursts. At night, they cleaned valves with toothbrushes, knowing 1 grain of grit could jam the ignition. Many taped a small mirror to the wand, so they could see around corners without exposing themselves, a trick learned from Pacific veterans. Their talk blended mechanical precision and fatalism. Pressure 90, valve tight, 2 bursts, one might say, and another would answer, "If I don't come back, burn the next one for me." Letters home reveal the psychological burden of their craft. Corporal Henry Martinez wrote to his wife from near Stolberg, "I use a weapon that makes men stop being soldiers and start being frightened animals. I don't like it, but it saves our boys, and that's reason enough." Some operators were rotated out after a few weeks, not for wounds, but for nerves. The army called it operational fatigue. The men called it fire shock. Sleep was elusive. Many claimed they could still hear the hissing even when the battlefield was silent. German prisoners often singled out the flamethrower men for respect mixed with horror. One captured sergeant told his interrogators, You could shoot at them all day and they still came forward, like walking furnaces. We thought no man could be brave enough to do that willingly. That perception, repeated in countless accounts, reinforced the myth that the Americans wielded some supernatural force. The courage of the Flame Men became part of the black magic narrative itself. How else, the Germans reasoned, could ordinary humans walk unharmed through fire? Behind the myth stood careful organization. Each U.S. Infantry Division maintained a chemical service detachment responsible for flame supply and repair. These crews operated mobile refill trucks that mixed gasoline and napalm powder on site, filling tanks with the same efficiency used to deliver artillery shells. At depots near Liège, workers in coveralls processed over 3,000 refill sets per week, keeping the flow steady through the harsh winter of 1944–45. The enemy saw this reliability as evidence of something unnatural. In truth, it was industrial discipline, the American genius for logistics applied to fire itself. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, the weapon's role changed. Once used to break bunkers, it became a tool for flushing out snipers and clearing factory complexes. At Cologne, in March 1945, a platoon of the 3rd Armored Division used flamethrowers to burn through an engine plant that had been converted into a strongpoint. Civilians later described the spectacle as liquid sunrise. The battle reports list it simply: objective secured, minimal resistance after flame application. Among the troops, a quiet superstition took hold. Many flame operators carried small crucifixes or medallions inside their jackets, even men who claimed no faith. One was found with the inscription, "Lord, keep me from burning what I should not." Such gestures were not bravado but balance and acknowledgement that the weapon they carried was both savior and curse. By the war's end, the flamethrower man had become one of the most paradoxical figures of the American army, part soldier, part engineer, part symbol of fear. The Germans' belief in black magic found its human counterpart in these operators, who seemed immune to the flames they unleashed. Yet their diaries and letters reveal something simpler: exhaustion, duty, and a grim understanding that in a world of mechanized slaughter, the most terrifying weapon was still one powered by breath, muscle, and the oldest element mankind had ever tamed: fire itself. February 19, 1945. Near the village of Hürtgen, the Siegfried Line still stood a chain of concrete dragon's teeth, bunkers, and interlocked trenches that had already devoured thousands of American lives. Snow muffled the sound of artillery, but the bunkers still spat machine gun fire from apertures barely wide enough to see daylight through. It was here that the U.S. First Army turned again to the weapon that could reach where no shell could: the flamethrower. Company C of the 104th Infantry Division had been ordered to clear a network of fortified pillboxes overlooking the Karl Trail. For days, mortars and bazookas had failed to break them. When the assault began at dawn, 3 flamethrower teams advanced behind tanks. The men moved low, their breath fogging inside their masks, boots crunching through crusted snow. One assistant carried a replacement nitrogen cylinder across his chest like a sacred object. At the first bunker, the tank's 75mm gun fired point blank. The shell chipped the concrete but failed to penetrate. Then Sergeant Frank D'Amico stepped forward, his M2 flamethrower gleaming faintly in the weak light. He crouched, took aim at the firing slit, and squeezed the trigger. The jet of napalm flame roared forth a tongue of orange and white that turned the snowy landscape into reflected hell. The jet entered the slit and ignited the air inside the bunker. Witnesses recalled seeing the entire structure breathe once, as if inhaling, before black smoke billowed from every crevice. D'Amico released the trigger, then fired again, this time sweeping the nozzle along the roof seam where the ventilator pipe emerged. Within seconds, the concrete began to weep molten tar from its paint. German soldiers burst from the rear door, unarmed, coughing, hands raised. The after-action report recorded the event in dry military. Prose: target neutralized, 4 enemy KIA, 8 surrendered. Flame application time, 12 seconds. What it did not mention was the transformation of the battlefield's sound. the thunder of artillery ceased, replaced by the steady whoosh of compressed fire, a new music of mechanized heat. Throughout February, flamethrowers became the spear point for the American push through the Siegfried Line. In the mud-choked forests near Schmidt, flame teams operated alongside demolition engineers, clearing obstacles and strongpoints one by one. Each engagement followed the same pattern. A rifle squad pinned the defenders, the flamethrower approached under smoke cover, and then came the blast of light. What had once taken hours now took minutes. Captured German reports from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division reveal panic spreading through their ranks. One officer's diary, found in a burned-out staff car, read, "They do not fight with courage, but with fire. Our men refuse to stay in. Bunkers. They say the Americans have liquid steel that burns underwater." The term Flüssiger Stahl, liquid steel, appeared repeatedly in intercepted messages, an attempt to rationalize the incomprehensible. The physics of napalm explained the illusion. When the jet struck snow or ice, the water instantly vaporized, producing a cloud of steam that carried burning droplets forward. The result looked as if the fire were moving through snow itself. To soldiers trapped inside, it seemed supernatural. The more they fought it, the more it multiplied. American engineers kept the flame flowing through sheer logistical precision. The Quartermaster Corps established flame supply points every 15 miles, each with mixing drums, compressors, and safety crews. In February alone, the First Army consumed over 150,000 gallons of thickened fuel. It was shipped in 5-gallon tins from Antwerp, trucked across Belgium, and distributed even to frontline rifle companies. No weapon depended more on industry, and none demonstrated that industrial power more viscerally. The winter conditions added grim hazards. Fuel lines froze, igniters fouled with snow. To keep the napalm mixture pliable, crews stored tanks in heated tents or buried them near stoves. The operators' gloves stiffened from heat and frost in the same hour. Yet despite these hardships, the weapon rarely failed. The M2's simplicity, no pump, no motor, only pressure and flame, made it as reliable as a match. When the Siegfried Line finally cracked open, the weapon that had once been an engineer's experiment became a symbol of American inevitability. One German colonel, captured near Monschau, told his interrogators, "You Americans fight with factories, we fight with faith. Your fire comes from machines, ours from prayer. And your machines are stronger." In post-war interviews, American soldiers spoke less about victory than about endurance. "You don't forget that sound," Private Earl Jennings said. "It's like the world breathing out." He paused before adding, "And then nothing moves." The Siegfried Line's fall was not a single explosion, but a slow dissolving of courage. Bunkers that had resisted artillery and armor yielded to the weapon that combined physics, chemistry, and fear. Fire had become a fluid, a tool that turned concrete to vapor and morale to ash. When the front advanced eastward toward the Rhine, German soldiers left graffiti on bunker walls. "Für Engel kommt, the fire angel comes." For them, it was not machinery but magic. For the Americans, it was merely pressure, napalm, and steel. But in those frozen hills, between smoke and snow, the two became indistinguishable, the science of one nation transformed into the sorcery of another. March 20th, 1945. In the darkness beyond the Rhine, the night rippled with a new kind of thunder. It was not artillery or bombers this time, but a sound heavier and slower like the exhalation of furnaces. The Zippo tanks of the U.S. Army's armored flamethrower companies were moving toward the river crossings near Remagen. Their official name was the M4, a 3R3 Sherman tanks, modified to carry a pressurized flame projector in place of the Hull machine gun. But to the men who drove them, they were known simply as Dragons. These armored flamethrowers had first appeared in the Pacific. On Iwo Jima and Saipan, the Marines had discovered that a steel-encased flamethrower could root the enemy out of caves faster than any explosive. Now, in Europe's cities, the same principle would apply to bunkers and factory ruins. The engineers at San Luis Obispo and Fort Knox had spent months adapting the Navy's Ronson flame system, named for the American cigarette lighter, that lights every time. Each armoured division in the European theatre had a few of these mechanical monsters. At Remagen, they led the assault across the Ludendorff Bridge. One eyewitness, Sergeant Paul Greeley of the 12th Armoured Division, remembered the moment the first dragon fired. "It was like sunrise in a bottle," he said. A ribbon of fire that hung in the air and then rolled forward as if it had weight. The napalm jet reached over 150 yards, long enough to drape itself across a German trench line. Within seconds, ammunition dumps ignited, tracer rounds spiralling into the sky like red bees. The bridgehead was secured within hours. To the Germans defending the West Bank, the sight was incomprehensible. Even hardened panzergrenadiers who had faced Allied bombers for years froze at the sight of a tank spewing fire instead of shells. Reports recovered from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division spoke of monsters that breathe flame and never stop. A lieutenant described them as dragons with iron skin. The men fired Panzerfausts, but unless the rocket struck precisely on the fuel line, a rare hit the tank simply kept advancing, wreathed in its own reflected glow. Inside those tanks, the atmosphere was infernal. Operators described the interior heat as unbearable after prolonged bursts. The crew wore asbestos gloves to handle the wand controls, and many tied handkerchiefs around their faces to filter the stench of scorched napalm. Yet they also reported an eerie calm. "You don't hear screams," one gunner noted later. "The sound of the flame drowns everything. It's just wind and pressure." The M4A3R3's mechanism was brutally efficient. A 260-gallon reservoir of napalm sat in the hull, pressurized by nitrogen bottles. When triggered, it expelled the fuel through a 4-inch hose and a nozzle mounted on the front hull, ignited by electric spark. Each burst lasted about 3 seconds, enough to drench a bunker or a row of buildings. Engineers calculated that the weapon could sustain roughly 60 bursts before emptying 3 minutes of fire that could decide an entire battle. The logistical support behind these dragons was staggering. Every gallon of napalm mix had to be blended within 48 hours of use, as the gel separated if left standing. Field depots operated like chemical factories under canvas, their crews working with measuring drums, mixers, and thick rubber gloves. At the Remagen bridgehead alone, over 50,000 gallons of fuel were prepared and pumped into armoured flamethrowers during the first week. The supply columns were labelled "Hazardous, do not smoke," though soldiers joked grimly that one spark would save them the trouble of crossing the river. After Remagen, the flame tanks rolled eastward through the Ruhr Valley. Their targets were no longer bunkers, but industrial plants converted to fortresses, cement mills, railway yards, and half-collapsed warehouses. The flames' purpose had shifted, from tactical breakthrough to psychological collapse. German prisoners captured in April reported mass panic wherever the burning tanks appeared. Civilians described the glow reflecting off factory windows miles away, calling it Höllenlicht, Hell's Light. To Allied commanders, the weapon's moral implications were secondary to its effect. Every fortified block reduced by flame meant fewer casualties from room-to-room fighting. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, wrote privately, "The fire tanks shorten battles. They end resistance the way a torch ends cobwebs." But for the crews, the moral cost was harder to ignore. After-action interviews reveal an unease behind the professional tone. Lieutenant Robert Morse admitted, "You see what it does. You tell yourself they'd have done the same. But afterward, when you smell that burnt fuel on your clothes, you don't feel like a hero, you feel like a blacksmith." By April, as the Allies encircled the Ruhr pocket, the flame tanks had become emblems of finality. When one appeared, surrender usually followed within minutes. The myth of black magic reached its zenith. Civilians whispered that the Americans had found a way to turn air itself into fire. The truth was less mystical but no less astonishing. Chemistry, compression, and unrelenting logistics, multiplied by American industry. Each burst that terrified a German trench represented a factory worker in Pennsylvania, a chemist in Maryland, a machinist in Detroit. The flames on the Rhine were not spontaneous. They were manufactured, shipped, and delivered with mathematical precision. When the war in Europe ended 6 weeks later, many of the flame tanks were scrapped or converted back into gun tanks. Their service was short, their legacy enduring. The men who rode them would remember the hiss of pressure and the moment the night turned to day. The Germans who faced them would remember something else, the conviction that only sorcery could make steel breathe fire. And so, in the final weeks of the Reich, even as radio towers fell silent and fuel stores ran dry, one legend persisted across the burning cities that the Americans had learned to command the oldest of the elements, and that the dragons of Remagen had come to finish what thunder began. April 20th, 1945. Berlin was burning from above, but in the forests and villages of western Germany, the fire came at eye level. In the closing weeks of the war, the U.S. Ninth Army swept through the Ruhr and toward the Elbe, encountering pockets of resistance in cellars, barns, and dugouts, places where surrender seemed dishonor and fire became the only key that fit. The flamethrower, perfected by then into the M2A1, was no longer just a tactical tool. It had become a symbol of finality, a weapon that announced to the Germans that their war was finished. In the ruined town of Dessau, Sergeant Alvin Proctor's squad was ordered to clear a series of interconnected cellars used by SS holdouts. Grenades had no effect. Rifle fire vanished into the blackness. Finally, 2 flame operators crawled forward, dragging the hose from a tank-mounted projector. Proctor later recalled, "You didn't think about it, you just lit it." The whole street turned orange. Afterward, they found that no one had survived. What shocked them more was what they found behind one wall: civilians, women and children, hiding beside the soldiers. The flame had reached them too. The official report omitted the details, recording simply "enemy neutralized," but the memory haunted those who carried the flame. Many soldiers began to question not just the weapon, but the act itself. Was this still combat, or execution by chemistry? Captain Roy Davenport, of the 83rd Division, noted in his field diary, "When we use flame, the fight ends, but it ends too absolutely. It doesn't leave room for anything human to remain." Across the lines, German soldiers were facing the same moral collapse from the other side. Captured diaries from the Volkssturm, a force of boys and old men, describe terror beyond reason. "When they bring the flame," wrote one 17-year-old near Halberstadt, "we do not fire, we only pray it passes." Others described comrades shooting themselves before the fuel reached them. At this stage of the war, resistance was often a reflex, not a strategy. Fire had broken not just defense lines, but the will to believe in them. The Geneva Convention had no specific prohibition against flamethrowers, only a clause regarding unnecessary suffering. Yet even among the Allies, debate simmered. The British preferred to limit flame use to armor or fortification clearance. The Americans, whose army had grown into an industrial juggernaut, saw it differently. The Chemical Warfare Service argued that flame weapons save lives by reducing duration of combat. Statistically, they were right. Attacks involving flamethrowers lasted 1/5 as long as conventional assaults. But the moral arithmetic remained uneasy. In hospitals and rest camps, flame operators were treated for a distinct form of trauma. Doctors called it thermal shock reaction, a condition marked by sleeplessness, tremors, and nausea triggered by smell or sound. The men themselves used darker words, the mirror burn. One explained, "You see what you do, and it sticks. The flame shines on you, too." Some refused further duty after a single mission. Others volunteered repeatedly, saying it was better to be the one holding the flame than waiting for it. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the weapon's legacy followed the soldiers home. War correspondents writing from Cologne and Kassel described charred ruins and melted weapons, still glistening from napalm residue. Civilians whispered that the Americans had used sunfire, a rumor that grew into legend among displaced Germans for decades. The reality that ordinary fuel, mixed and pressurized, could summon such devastation seemed harder to accept than the myth. In Washington, the moral debate surfaced quietly in military reviews. The Army's Historical Division concluded in 1946, flame weapons achieved decisive tactical results but produced psychological effects that exceeded intent. The terror they inspired may have shortened resistance but deepened hatred. Some officers argued for their abolition, others saw them as a necessary evil. The Cold War would soon make that discussion obsolete, as napalm evolved into a weapon for a new generation of conflicts. Among veterans, memory turned inward. Many flame operators refused to speak about their service for decades. In post-war interviews, they described a paradoxical pride and revulsion, the pride of effectiveness, the revulsion of intimacy. "You didn't shoot from a distance," said one. "You watched it happen, and you made it happen." For the Germans, the memory fused with a superstition. Rural villagers in the Rhineland told their children of the firemen who came at the war's end, spirits who carried twin metal lungs and left behind nothing but smoke. What had begun as a misunderstanding of chemistry became folklore, a moral scar passed down through generations. When historians look back, they see the flamethrower as part of the brutal logic of total war technology pushed to its emotional limit. It was not the most destructive weapon of the war, but perhaps the most personal. A shell could kill from miles away. The flame demanded proximity. It required one man to stand close enough to see another's eyes, and then erase him. By 1945, the Germans no longer called it black magic. They called it schwarze Tod, the Black Death. Not mystical, not divine, but something worse, a human invention that burned through both flesh and conscience. In the silence after the last flames died, the Americans cleaned their tanks and buried their dead. The engineers wrote new manuals, the factories prepared for peacetime. Yet in the ruins of Europe, where the concrete still smelled faintly of smoke, one truth lingered. The war had ended, but the age of fire had only begun. May 10th, 1945. Germany had capitulated, but the smoke had not yet cleared from its cities. In the charred remains of Aachen, Cologne, and Kassel, Allied survey teams moved methodically through blackened streets, collecting data for what would become the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, European Theatre. Their mission was not vengeance, but analysis to quantify destruction, to measure morale, to turn ruin into numbers. Yet even among statisticians and engineers, one weapon defied quantification: the flamethrower. Its effectiveness could be plotted, but its impact could not be contained in graphs. The final reports from the front read more like anthropology than engineering. German officers spoke not of losses in men or material, but of spirit. A colonel of the 353rd Infantry Division told his interrogators at Bad Hersfeld, "The Americans fight like engineers, but their fire feels like hate. It comes in waves, perfect, unending. It is not a weapon, it is a law of nature." Others repeated the same word zwang, compulsion. They had fought tanks, bombers, artillery. But the flamethrower, they said, broke their will in a way no machine could, because it turned the air itself into an enemy. In Washington, the Army's Chemical Warfare Service began assembling post-war data. Lieutenant Colonel Louis F. McCrary, who had overseen flame operations in Europe, presented his findings to the General Staff. The flame weapon is not primarily destructive, but decisive. Its power lies in altering the enemy's behavior before engagement. This phrase, behavioral weapon, entered military vocabulary quietly but permanently. It described something beyond ballistics, the manipulation of fear as a measurable tool. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, engineers dissected, captured German flamethrowers, the Flammenwerfer 41, 42, and the enormous Höllenhund prototype. They found them crude by comparison: short range, leaky seals, fragile ignition. German design had pursued efficiency. American design had pursued certainty. The M2's redundant systems, dual cartridges, heavy tanks, reinforced hoses were overbuilt, wasteful, and utterly reliable. That overbuilding, mirrored in American logistics and manufacturing, became its own doctrine, redundancy as invincibility. The question that haunted post-war analysts was why the weapon's psychological effect had been so disproportionate. The answer came not from engineers, but from psychologists working under the Army's Human Resources Research Division. Their 1946 memorandum, Fear Reactions to Flame and Sound Stimuli in Confined Spaces, concluded that flame, unlike other weapons, invokes pre-rational dread rooted in universal human experience. Simply put, bullets engage reason, fire engages instinct. Every man alive carries memory of what fire means: warmth, destruction, the border between safety and annihilation. Thus, the weapon functioned as both physics and archetype. It attacked the mind before it touched the body. In tactical briefings, American officers began to describe flame operations as emotional artillery. One captain summarized it best: "You don't aim a flamethrower, you demonstrate it." The concept would echo through later wars, from Korea to Vietnam, where napalm would become not just a weapon but a language of intimidation. Meanwhile, in Germany, Reconstruction authorities catalogued the effects on civilian morale. In a study conducted by the British Control Commission, former Wehrmacht officers ranked weapons by psychological impact. Flamethrowers topped the list, ahead of tanks, rockets, and bombs. "When the fire came," wrote one respondent, "discipline failed. We thought it a punishment, not a tactic." This confusion between science and sin became part of the cultural reckoning that followed. Churches held sermons on the moral boundaries of modern warfare. Theologians debated whether manufactured flame represented human mastery or hubris. American newspapers largely ignored these questions. To the home front, the flamethrower was simply another proof of industrial ingenuity, one more machine among thousands that had ended the war sooner. The Chicago Tribune described it as a firefighter turned in reverse. The New York Times called it an engineer's nightmare perfected. No one mentioned the faces of the men who carried it or the screams of those who faced it. In military academies, however, the lessons hardened into doctrine. Manuals emphasized three truths drawn from the European campaigns. First, that flame induced surrender faster than any explosive. Second, that its effectiveness multiplied when combined with armor. And, third, that its greatest power was psychological. By the late 1940s, West Point cadets studied Aachen and Remagen not as battles of attrition, but as case studies in emotional warfare, how terror, properly organized, could be as strategic as steel. And yet, beneath that logic, unease persisted. General Omar Bradley wrote privately in his memoirs, "We fought a mechanical war, but we won with primal tools." In his handwritten notes, now archived at the U.S. Army Heritage Center, he added a single line beneath the entry for flame operations: "Efficiency at the cost of innocence." The post-war years brought peace, but not moral resolution. The flamethrower, retired from public view, lingered in memory as the weapon that had crossed an invisible threshold. It was too close, too human, too honest about what war had become. In its roaring breath, the modern battlefield revealed its final truth, that victory and annihilation had become the same act, measured not in miles gained or fortresses destroyed, but in the silence that followed when the fire went out. And so, when historians later spoke of black magic, they were not wrong. It was magic of a sort not the occult kind imagined by terrified soldiers, but the darker miracle of human invention, where reason builds instruments to terrify reason itself. In that sense, the flamethrower was more than a weapon. It was a mirror reflecting the century's genius and its guilt, both burning in the same light.